Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Tom Banchoff. I'm director of the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown. And on behalf of our center community, I'm delighted to welcome you to our historic Riggs Library for a celebration. Our colleague and friend, Reverend David Hollenbach of the Society of Jesus, has just published a critical new book, Human Rights in a Divided World, Catholicism as a Living Tradition, a book that we are launching together this afternoon. I'm especially delighted to welcome David's friends, his fans, his students, and former students in person here and online around the world on this very happy occasion. If you know David, you know why I'm emphasizing the phrase former students. Because anyone who moves in our world of Jesuit universities across the globe, the world of departments of theology and religious studies, the world of scholars of religion and human rights, will often come across many of David's former students, his academic offspring, if you like, now leading scholars, educators, and practitioners in the field, all having benefited from his brilliance as a teacher and his caring mentorship over the years. As many of you know, David is one of the world's leading authorities on the church and world affairs. He serves here at Georgetown as the Pedro Arrupe Distinguished Research Professor in our School of Foreign Service, as well as a senior fellow in the Berkeley Center. He's the author of a range of path-breaking books. I'm just going to name a few of the most influential: Humanity in Crisis, Ethical and Religious Response to Refugees, The Global Face of Public Faith, and The Common Good and Christian Ethics, as well as innumerable articles in scholarly and popular journals. David's interest and expertise in human rights is deep and long-standing. Before coming to Georgetown, he held the University Chair in Human Rights and International Justice at Boston College, where he also served as director of the Center for Human Rights and International Justice. In his voluminous scholarship, David has always approached human rights both as an academic discipline and as a gospel imperative, closely linked with the call to accompany the poor, the marginalized, the refugee, those in need in our midst. And he's always done so from a truly global perspective, having taught for many years at Hekima University College in Nairobi, at the Jesuit Philosophy Institute in Ho Chi Minh City, and elsewhere around the world. David is a past president of the Catholic Theological Society of America, recipient of its John Courtney Murray Award, and has gathered many accolades and a few honorary degrees over his distinguished career. David, it's really wonderful to have you here, to have all of you here for this opportunity to engage with you around this important new book, Human Rights in a Divided World. I think we can all agree that's very well put. In a world marked by the crisis of democracy and the rise of authoritarianism, a world in which the reality of universal human rights appears on the defensive, where do we go from here? Can we, should we, insist on the universality of human rights in academic and policy debates, given the stark reality of a world deeply divided along political and ideological lines? Should we even try? And if the answer is yes, which I think it is, and I think David thinks it is, how can the Catholic Church and its living tradition of political and social thought help us in that important task? These are just some of the big questions that concern us this afternoon, questions raised in your exceptional book, David, questions we'll have a chance to discuss in depth together with you and with three of your friends and colleagues, brilliant scholars in their own right. Just very brief introductions so we can jump right into the conversation. Kathleen Keaveney is the Darrell and Juliet Libby Professor at Boston College and a leading expert on issues of religion, ethics, and law, with appointments in both the Department of Theology and the Law School. The Reverend A.E. Orobator of the Society of Jesus is Dean of the Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara in Berkeley, California, and a wide-ranging and influential theologian, and I would add, until recently, a member of Georgetown's Board of Directors. And Michael J. Perry is the Robert W. Woodruff Professor of Law Emeritus at Emory University, a leading authority on law, religion, and human rights, and I would add there, also an alumnus of Georgetown University. So thank you for joining us. Thanks again to everyone here and online. Like all of you, I really look forward to this conversation, and I'd ask you to please now join me in welcoming David and the panel to the stage.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'm very grateful for your generous introduction and highlighting some of the issues that I have tried to work on over the years. And it's also true that what we're going to talk about this afternoon, I think, is a lively subject given the state of the world that we're living in. The book is called Human Rights in a Divided World, and it's pretty clear. There's no doubt that we're living in a very divided world. We're moving toward the voting for democracy or against it in numerous countries around the world. Some people have been calling this the decade of democracy. And how we respond to that is ambiguous. There is response on a negative side coming out of the United States, in Germany with the Alternative für Deutschland, which takes a very critical stance toward democracy, and a number of other places. So my book is an attempt to bring the idea of human rights to the fore in the midst of these divisions. Now, one of the reasons why the division is so extraordinary in these days, and it has been highlighted by a number of the commentators, on that some people think that human rights are too individualistic in their orientation. There's an approach that says human rights means my rights, leave me alone, don't bother with me. My argument in my book, however, is that that's an inappropriate way to understand the meaning of human rights. I want to try to highlight the fact that human rights are all about human participation in community. There's another way of thinking about this, that the stress on communitarian values that can be found in Confucianism in China, can be found in African traditional religion in Africa, that can be found in the Islamic world in numerous ways. This stress on the more communal connections between people is something that I think ought to be understood as part of what the human rights agenda is all about. I try to make the argument that human rights are about guaranteeing people participation in community, not leaving them alone. For example, in South Africa, during the struggle against apartheid, that struggle was not a struggle saying black people should be left alone. That struggle against apartheid was all about guaranteeing black people the right to participate in the economic, political, and social life of the country of South Africa, in guaranteeing them participation. And if you understand human rights in that way, human rights are not to be understood individualistically, but rather solidaristically, or guaranteeing human rights as a form of participation in community in solidarity with one's neighbor. Now, this has deep roots in some aspects of Western thought. It goes back to the biblical commandment to love your neighbor as yourself, which obviously means that those who follow that tradition should be strongly committed to protecting their neighbors and sharing their lives with their neighbors. It also goes back to the days of Aristotle in a more secular vein. Aristotle defined the human person as a political animal. He called it in Greek the zoon politikon, an animal who is one of the polis of the city. And therefore, human rights, if you were going to take that Aristotelian approach, is not about leaving people alone, but guaranteeing them the right to be part of the community, the polis, the political life of society. So my book is basically making an argument in its more theoretical stages that there is a way in which human rights should not be understood individualistically, and therefore human rights interpreted that way can make a very important contribution to healing some of the rifts that are dividing our world between Confucians in China, Muslims in the Arab and Islamic world, between Africans and the African societies, that overcoming the divisions between the West and the rest, if you will, is something that an interpretation of human rights that follows in the direction that I go can lead us. And I want to argue in my book that that the Catholic tradition can make significant contributions to that because of the strong communal orientation of Catholicism. Catholicism stresses the meaning of the common good very strongly. You go back to Thomas Aquinas, and Aquinas asks, what is the fundamental goal of justice? And Aquinas says the fundamental goal of justice is the promotion of the common good, promoting the community that enables people to share with one another the good that they need for their well-being. Human dignity, in other words, is not simply a matter of being left alone, but of being part of the human community. I would argue then in my book that this more theoretical concept of human rights, which I see as a growth from the Catholic tradition, but also from the secular tradition in a way that I interpret it in an Aristotelian vein, has important contributions to make to a number of practical issues today. Religious freedom, for example. Religious freedom is not simply a matter of leaving people alone, but enabling religious communities to make contributions to the society in which they live. It's all about the rights of refugees. If anything means, if human rights of refugees mean anything, it means they should not be left out. They should be included in, and so the rights of refugees include, number one, the right to asylum, to being granted status in a country rather than left somehow stateless and floating in the extreme negative areas of life. The participation in society economically, so that human rights guarantee people the minimum conditions required economically for them to be participants in society. And finally, that's true of the rights of women. The rights of women to be taken as serious members of the human community, participating members of the human community, and active, not simply leaving them alone, but also guaranteeing them access and participation in the human community. So those are some overviews of what I'm up to in human rights in a divided world, and the living tradition of Catholicism and the way it can make a contribution to this. Now I'm going to invite several of our other speakers to come to the podium. We're going to hear first from Kathleen Keaveney, and I invite Kathleen, therefore, to come forward and make her comments about the book, and we'll see where it goes from there. Following Kathleen, we'll have a presentation by Abangyamenge Orobator, a Jesuit who is now the dean of the School of Theology and Ministry in Santa Clara, but who's an indigenous Nigerian, and we're grateful to have him here, and Michael Perry, who is also from Emory University Law Center. So Kathleen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a tremendous honor to have been asked to comment on David Hollenbach's Human Rights in a Divided World, Catholicism as a Living Tradition. David has been a role model for me from the time I was in graduate school, and for that matter, so is my fellow commentator, Professor Michael Perry, and I'm look forward to having a new role model in Orobator. So it's a delight to be here, not only for what I can contribute, but also for what I can learn. Why is David such a great role model? Well, he has a tremendous grasp of the Catholic social justice tradition. He shows deep engagement with secular, philosophical, and legal sources at the highest level. But most importantly is his commitment, grounded in his Jesuit charism, to be a person for others, deeply committed to using his tremendous intellectual gifts to call attention to the suffering of other people in this nation and around the world. So I only have a few minutes for remarks here, and we're going to have a wonderful conversation later on. But in my remarks, I'd like to do three things. First, situate the book a little bit in the context of David's other books. Not all of his other books, just 2 other books. We'd be here forever if I had to do all of David's books. Second, say a couple of things about the distinctively important method and approach of this book. And third, since this is a conversation, I would like to raise 2 questions that came to my mind after reading Human Rights in a Divided World. So that's my plan for my remarks. Let's start with his other books, or particularly 2 of his other books. There's a book that he wrote a little while ago now, just a little while ago, called Claims in Conflict, Retrieving and Renewing the Catholic Human Rights Tradition. It was published in 1979. It still offers the best account of the development of the Catholic social justice tradition from Leo XIII to Pope Paul VI. It was on my comprehensive exam list when I was in graduate school. And what I still remember was distinctive about this book was his recognition, which is still present today, that negative rights, the rights of the individual-oriented freedom rights, might be in tension with positive rights, such as the right to economic sustenance, but that tension can and must be managed. He noted how the Western liberalism protected the negative rights, freedom from, but also introduced us to the ways in which Marxist traditions, other countries that were drawing on communist philosophy, but not only communist philosophy, protected positive rights. And he saw the Catholic tradition as insisting that both traditions must be affirmed, and while there were tensions, they could not be pit against each other. That's book 1. The second book I'd like to emphasize of his is The Common Good and Christian Ethics. That was published in 2002, and it was on the comps list of many of the ethicists at Boston College, at Santa Clara, and around the country who got tenure more recently. The key thing about this book was how it incorporated the virtue of solidarity into his account, emphasizing that rights are not to be understood as vociferous claims of isolated individuals, but are a way, as he said in his own remarks, to enable the participation of all in a common life. Rights are not to be understood as being pitted against the common good, but are means of enabling full participation in the common good. And now I would like to say that human rights in a divided world, Catholicism as a living tradition, is on the comps list for all of our students for the next 20 years. It is magisterial in two senses of the word. First, it exhibits a comprehensive knowledge of the field, recapitulating and integrating magisterial teaching from his lifetime of work. So we see the magisterial Catholic social teaching from Leo XIII brought up to date to Pope Francis. But it also emphasizes the meaning of the word magister as teacher. Magisterial just doesn't mean I'm standing on a high platform looking down at all of you peons saying words that, that none of you understand. I don't think the word ontological appeared even once in the book. Certainly not the word hermeneutics. David Hollenbach makes his case clearly, calmly, and persuasively. He does not fall prey to the tendency to inflate rhetoric or to insult his opponents. It is a book that models the kind of consideration he hopes that we engage in. There are discussions of human rights in the book in relation to Catholicism that I think advance the discussion in three ways. First, I think the book is very hopeful. Hollenbach situates human rights language in the Catholic Church within a developing but also fallible tradition. So to see the importance of Catholic thought in the human rights tradition, you don't have to say, we got it all right, we are perfect, don't worry about anybody else's perspective, just go with us on each and every point for the past 2,000 years. He defends the Catholic contribution to the human rights tradition without being defensive about its considerable flaws. Just 2 points. He cites Tott, Philpott, and Shaw as saying that between 1972 and the year 2009, the Catholic community played a role in advancing democracy in 36 out of 78 countries that made substantial democratic advances. That is on-the-ground practical contribution to the realm of human rights and democracy. But at the same time, he does not shy away from the failures of Catholics in dealing with slavery centuries ago, or in the genocide of Rwanda recently, or in recognizing the full equality and contribution of the role of women. On the way over, David Hollenbach pointed out the newly named Isaac Hawkins building, which was named for the first slave sold by Georgetown to the South in order to maintain this beautiful campus. And I think that Georgetown University is grappling honestly with clear eyes with its complicity in slavery is a model both of reckoning with the past in a humble way, but moving forward with hope. Secondly, Hollenbach defends the robust conception of human dignity against those who argue, for one reason or other, that it is not useful or it makes no sense. He defines the obligating features of personhood as freedom, relationality, and the meeting of basic needs. He's indebted to our mutual teacher, Margaret Farley, on this point, and I would just like to invoke her here in our midst because she's in our hearts and our minds. David shows the mutual illumination of practical reason and theoretical reasoning as found in religion, practical reason rather, and theoretical reason as found in religion. And he provides 3 secular warrants for human dignity that I know Michael Perry will pick up later: transcendence of mind, sacredness of conscience, and exercise of liberty. And third, in many places, he faces without obfuscation the conflict between cultural norms and human rights. He does not hesitate to get involved in questions of how people who advocate human rights should engage questions such as female genital mutilation, which involves not simply the Western understanding of what the dignity of women involves, but also, if you listen to some of the practitioners, as hard as it may be for us to believe, who are in the West, that this actually contributes to women's dignity and power. It makes it a very easy case if we ignore that side of the equation. It makes it a much harder case if that side is there. But at the same time, he also looks at practices such as mass rape as a tool of warfare and intimidation and says under no circumstances can we tolerate this. There's no cultural imperative for that kind of violation of women. So David makes judgments that are grounded in reason, empathy, and tradition understood broadly. Now for my two questions for the conversation. David Hollenbach in this book deeply engages the human right of religious liberty and engages as well the document of Dignitatis Humanae, the Declaration of Religious Liberty, and the pioneering work of John Courtney Murray. I am now going to commit a tiny bit of heresy here, just light heresy, you might say, by questioning whether John Courtney Murray's approach is fully adequate for our time in this respect. Dignitatis Humanae, according to Hollenbach, it's quoted in the book, says that the freedom of man is to be respected as far as possible and curtailed only when and insofar as necessary. In analyzing this text, which was clearly near to his heart, Murray added that this meant freedom should be limited only so far as necessary to preserve society's very existence. That's a very high bar. And it's reflected in the Vatican documents in terms of the notion of public order, which is much narrower than the notion of the common good. It includes justice, public peace, and standards of public morality on which there is consensus. Hollenbach, following Murray, argues that civil law should only be used to promote this notion or narrower notion of public order. But here's my question. Maybe we need to broaden our notion of what the law can do and nuance our notion of what kinds of law are doing it. I fully agree that the criminal law should be limited to promoting public order as understood by Murray, but I wonder whether other types of law, such as incentives in tax law to encourage home ownership, or disincentives in other kinds of law to discourage smoking, can provide a bridge between the criminal law and the broader civil law, and actually say other types of law can promote the common good, provided they don't do so in purely coercive ways. So that's my question one. My question two has to do with the religious freedom cases that have been argued by many religious people about such things as covering contraceptives or participating in health plans that cover abortion and contraceptives. So the Little Sisters of the Poor, for example, did not want even to sign a form at one point that indicated their objection to participating in a health plan that covered contraception and abortion. That's not a direct wrong claim. That's a claim of complicity. The nuns were not putting contraceptive pills on the tongues of the people who were using them. They were funding it. They were 2 or 3 steps away from the actual use of contraception. So my second question is, do people in a civil society, a pluralistic liberal democracy, have to have a positive notion of facilitating other people's views of what the good life is for them that can't be narrowly analyzed within the complicity or cooperation with evil framework? If we live in a pluralist society, do not we have to become a little bit comfortable with facilitating other people's view of the good lives that don't agree with our own? Those are my 2 questions. It's a great honor to be here, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. Thank you, David. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here at this moment, David, knowing what you represent for so many of us. I would count myself as one of your students, and privileged now to be a colleague, and for the many times and many moments that you contributed your talent, your expertise, your wisdom to the formation of Jesuits of my generation and following in all of Africa, particularly at Ekima University College. So I want to thank you for that. And talking about your book, reading it for me had the quality of a narrative time lapse, basically just because of the captivating manner in which you detailed and described the origins, the changes, and the significant milestones of the Catholic tradition on human rights over time, the peoples, the events, the places that have shaped this living tradition. Obviously, I would be looking at it from two perspectives, because I am Catholic and I'm from Africa. And so those are two lenses through which I try to look at this book. First thing that I found striking about it is just the understanding that this tradition of Catholicism, a living tradition, is built not out of a theory, but engendered by a living faith. And I'll come back to that later. I know there is a broad consensus on what constitutes human rights, be they individual, social, economic, political, and civil. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights offers a fairly comprehensive inventory that arguably has stood the test of time. The question, though, that your book helped me to answer is a simple one. What makes human rights human? What makes human rights human? Remember, I just said that it's a tradition that is built not out of a theory. And I think without distracting yourself by arguments about, the subjects and the contents of rights, you helped me understand that Catholicism answers by identifying a set of foundational principles and values. And these will be dignity, solidarity, common good, and equality, which you robustly defended in your book. And this becomes for me the raw material of a foundation of rights. And this for me humanize and put faces on rights. And the pursuit and promise of justice and human rights in a globalized world would falter when and if these principles are undermined, distorted, or neglected. A second point by way of introduction is that you make it very clear, David, that Catholicism has done much to promote and prioritize these principles and values, and in the process has become, and I'm quoting you now, a major global leader and force for the promotion and defense of human rights. That is true, and I'll come back to that later. But it's not all smooth sailing. As you point out, the tradition of human rights faces stiff headwinds whipped up by conflicts of race, ethnicity, religion, nationality that we see around us constantly. As I read your book, I was thinking about the summer race riots in England that targeted minority and immigrant communities. And I couldn't but, pay attention to the protracted internecine conflict between Hamas and Israel, and so many other conflicts across the world. And I know you don't say it so quite bluntly, but it's very clear that conflicts are bad for human rights, just bad for human rights. So having said that, I just want to point out 7 things I took away, or insights I took away from this book, or rather things I think I understood better for reading this book. Just 7 quick points. The first, speaking of religion and Catholicism, that the notion of human rights is not the preserve of any religious group or domain. And in fact, as you point out, religion can advance and impede the realization of human rights. And you give many examples of the former, how it advances, but you don't shy away from also how it impedes and creates obstacles. And there are demonstrable instances in history where and when a mistaken understanding of Catholicism's purpose threatened and weakened the church's capacity to promote human rights. And therefore illustrating the point you make about Scott Appleby's insightful notion of the ambivalence of the sacred. It can cut both ways. The second thing that I thought I understood better was, as I hinted earlier on the defense of human rights or its lack thereof, is that it's not merely theoretical. There are serious implications and consequences from the failure to uphold human rights. And when we fail, or rather fall below the threshold of a morality of depth, we require constant vigilance to avoid these failures. And I agree with you, David, that from a Christian point of view, we can acknowledge that the continuing struggle for human rights will, however, help us avoid the most sinful distortions of humanity and the deepest wounds upon human community. The third thing is simply this: charity begins at home. You know, human rights is a living tradition, not only of the church, but for the church. And so while there is this quote that was quoted, used to be quoted quite fairly regularly from the Synod of 1971, where the bishop said, while the church is bound to give witness to justice, she recognizes that anyone who ventures to speak to people about justice must first be just in their eyes. And so, reading your book, it's not enough to respect the freedoms of other faith communities as a Christian community. We also need to challenge the church to embrace just practices within its own communities. And we have instances of where, I think John Borelli is here, he's documented in his writing, the instances where we have failed as a Christian community to honor that commitment, to uphold the dignity and rights of human beings in our community. And the fourth point is, and this is the one that I'm particularly very interested in, again, because of my own background. So despite apparent tensions, personal freedoms are not incompatible with social and cultural norms. I think you point that out. I was heartened when, David, you appealed to the concept of Ubuntu, which affirms the social and relational understanding of the human person and shows us very clearly that human rights carry a social premium, in the sense that however we look at it, we cannot simply be locked into an extremely individualistic corner or collectivist corner, but rather through the concept of solidarity, we can actually instantiate human rights in a way that facilitates, as you say, participation in community. And very simply, I would agree with you that the practice of human rights strengthens participation in community, in a community of freedoms, And so in this sense, a balanced compromise is possible. Personal freedom is as vital as solidarity is crucial. And keeping that balance is important for us to maintain a dignified social, political, and economic living. And I would add that, Pope Francis's Manual for a Culture of Encounter, Fratelli Tutti, definitely offers an authoritative discourse on this connection, as you pointed out. But also the idea of humanity, which you dwelt on at length. The idea that we share in this common humanity. And so, without prejudice to the distinctive qualities and gifts or situations or circumstances that define peoples and persons, you know. And then the fifth point is the tension between religious freedom and and how that plays out in convictions in public life and morality. Thank you. And this for me is particularly acute here in the States, and I speak as an outsider now, seeing how the tension between reconciling aspects of respect for religious freedoms of communities, while at the same time seeking to influence public life, propagate public morality, and dictate public policy on a range of issues, and how that, again, creates a divided society. And the point you make, which I agree with, it's not enough to simply advocate for privatization of religion, because that only serves as a cover for individualistic ethical frameworks. But I don't see any easy solution, because personally and communally, we are invested in what constitutes just practices, what constitutes human rights. And so making that bridge or that transition from that which we understand within a particular community to that which is now applicable to the wider society, I think will remain a constant challenge. And I don't think it's possible to settle that in the book that you have written. But it's important to note that as a community, as a Christian community, we do not hold a monopoly over the discourse. And so it becomes important to enter into dialogical encounters with other religious communities. The sixth point, the debate about human rights is not an esoteric or disembodied discourse. It concerns real people. And you point that out very clearly. It concerns people like the persecuted Uyghur people in China, the oppressed women in Taliban's Afghanistan, the girl children abducted in northern Nigeria, and so many other instances where human dignity is violated. It's about real people. And we could never forget that. Again, I go back to the point I made. It's not born out of a theory. It's engendered by living faith, which is carried by people. The final point I would make is that, and I think this has been pointed out, the single most disturbing deficit and gap in the tradition on human rights concerns securing and protecting the equal dignity and rights of women. Across the world, that is true. And I think, as David, you point out, you criticize the practice tendency to treat women negatively differently on account of cultural norms and religious traditions, and very clearly, this needs to change. Now, while persuasion, education, and moral argumentation may serve as the first line of intervention, well, circumstances that pose clear and present threats to the dignity and safety and security of people, especially women in situations of violent conflict, would require deploying robust mechanisms of coercion. I agree. What is at issue here, I think, is the tension between the universality of human rights and cross-cultural differences. And practicing open, critical, and candid cross-cultural dialogue would help navigate this tension, which I believe is your principal achievement in this tour de force. So to conclude then, to say that Catholic tradition on human rights is a living tradition is to concede that it is not finished, final, and unchangeable, in a way that will preclude further radical development and creative interpretation in response to realities of our complex and divided world. I hope that the next phase of this book will talk about climate change, ecology, how that constitutes also part of this discourse of human rights, because it's about human beings. There was a time when Catholicism considered human rights and participatory democracy as anathemas, and even condoned egregious violations of human freedoms like slavery and colonialism. Not anymore. I think David's narrative of the long road to human rights is a compelling portrait of Catholicism as a living tradition how it has changed, how it is changing, and how it will continue to change. Thank you.
I am honored and delighted to be a participant in this launch of David's new book. I'm also delighted to be back here at Georgetown University, from whose College of Arts and Sciences I graduated 56 years ago this past June. Still trying to get my head around that, 56 years. Before I present my comments, the comments I've prepared, let me share with you what I said about David and his book, as quoted both on the back cover of the book and more fully on the website of the Georgetown University Press. David Hollenbach has long been one of the most important human rights scholars in the English-speaking world. His new book is a major contribution to the study of and essential reading for anyone interested in the contemporary Catholic Church's theory of human rights and the contemporary Catholic community's practice of human rights. The book's concluding argument that the magisterium of the Church needs to go further than it has in affirming the human rights of women, is compelling. Now my comments. One of my principal areas of scholarly expertise is human rights theory. And in my comments this afternoon, I want to bring one of my foremost concerns as a human rights theorist to bear on David's book. In particular, on the first 2 chapters of the book, which are brimming with what I call dignity talk, is indeed a lot of the conversation so far has been. By dignity talk, I mean talk, discourse, that argues, states, implies, or presupposes that every human being has equal dignity. The Oxford English Dictionary gives this as the principal definition of dignity, quote, the quality of being worthy or honorable, worthiness, worth, nobleness, excellence. And to say that every human being has equal dignity is to say that no human being has more dignity or less than any other human being. In the words of Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all human beings are equal in dignity. It bears mention here today that the moral discourse of the magisterium of the Catholic Church is, like David's book, brimming with dignity talk. See most recently the Declaration on Human Dignity, Dignitas Infinita, which was promulgated in April of this year by the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. And I commend to you the symposium on Dignitas Infinita published this past June by Commonweal, a symposium that includes a characteristically illuminating essay by Kathy Caveney. As David acknowledges on page 17 of his book, Dignity Talk, quote, faces considerable challenges today. And as it happens, I myself question the plausibility of dignity talk. Indeed, if my comments had a title, it would be something like this: skeptical about dignity talk, but not about human rights. Please bear in mind that in the brief time allotted to each of us panelists, I can do no more than provide a brief sketch of my skepticism about Dignity Talk. For a much fuller discussion, I shamelessly commend to you my book, Interrogating the Morality of Human Rights, published just last year, and because published on an open access basis, available online for free. There are two principal kinds of dignity talk, secular and theistic. I want to say a few words about the former before turning to the latter. It's open to serious question whether secular dignity talk is justifiable. More precisely, whether dignity talk is justifiable on the basis of a secular worldview. Consider this question. Is there anything common to all human beings in virtue of which every human being has equal dignity? It's doubtful that there is a plausible secular answer to that question. I'm guessing that at least some of you here this afternoon will concur in the following judgment of the University of Chicago philosopher Brian Leiter. I quote him, quote, "The moral egalitarianism that is central to modern morality cannot be defended on any basis other than the supposition that there is an egalitarian God that invests everyone with equal moral worth." Leiter continues, "Here is the dilemma that haunts the basis of equality problem. Any feature of persons one might identify as justifying their equal treatment is not in fact shared equally by persons, thus raising the question how it could justify equality of moral consideration. People differ, for example, in their rationality, their sensitivity to pleasure and pain, and their moral capacities, not to mention, to put it in more banal terms, their intelligence, alertness, and empathy. If what warrants equal moral consideration is reason, sentience, or moral sensitivity, then there is no reason to think that humans per se warrant equal moral consideration, given how much they differ in these attributes. As I said, it's open to serious question whether dignity talk is justifiable on the basis of a secular worldview. Be that as it may, let's now turn to theistic dignity talk, which I assume for many of you here this afternoon is of greater interest than secular dignity talk. Again, is there anything common to all human beings in virtue of which every human being has equal dignity? Some theistic answers to that question are familiar to many of us. For example, all human beings are created in the image of God. Another example, spoken by Pope Francis in, among other writings, the 2015 encyclical Laudato Si, quote, "The special love of the Creator for each human being confers upon him or her an infinite dignity." But are such answers, as familiar as they are, theologically plausible? That depends, of course, on the particular theology on the basis of which such answers are being evaluated. For some of us, the most intellectually defensible theology on offer is a negative or apophatic theology, constituted in part by the following three propositions, none of which I hasten to add is, from the standpoint of Catholicism, theologically heterodox. Indeed, my citations in support and illustration of the three propositions are to the writings of Catholic philosophers and theologians, writings published more often than not in the Dominican periodical New Blackfriars. Proposition number one: what God is not only unknown, but unknowable. Proposition number two: the least problematic talk about God is A, negative, the via negativa, God is not a person, and B, analogical. For example, God is like a mother. Proposition 3, anthropomorphic talk about God, which is the most common sort of God talk among Christians and Jews, is radically misconceived and even is understood as only analogical, greatly misleading. I invite you to consider whether a theology that comprises the foregoing 3 propositions can even accommodate, much less warrant, either of the 2 theistic answers I mentioned a few minutes ago. The answer that all human beings are created in the image of God, or the answer that the special love of the Creator for each human being confers upon him or her an infinite dignity. If you, like me, conclude that such a theology cannot accommodate either of those answers, and if you, like me, are inclined to affirm such a theology, then for you as for me, theistic dignity talk is, as a theological matter, of questionable plausibility. I said that if these comments had a title, it would be something like Skeptical About Human Dignity, but Not About Human Rights. What can account for, what can animate one's commitment to human rights if one is skeptical about dignity talk, both theistic and secular? Consider the following answer, imagining my interlocutor giving the following answer. I detest and oppose states of affairs in which human beings, any human beings, not just myself and those to whom for whom I happen to care deeply, such as my family and friends, suffer grievously in consequence of a misguided or even hateful law, policy, action, or failure to act. I detest and oppose such states of affairs because I detest and oppose such suffering, the suffering of any human beings in consequence of misguided or hateful human choices. And so with like-hearted others, I work to build a world in which such suffering is over time diminished, all the while remembering with Dietrich Bonhoeffer that, quote, we have for once learned to see the great events of world history from below, from the perspective of the outcast, the suspects, the maltreated, the powerless, the oppressed, the reviled, in short, from the perspective of those who suffer. So, as that foregoing answer reflects, one's commitment to human rights is easily understood as whatever else it is understood as, a way of opposing the suffering of any human beings in consequence of misguided or hateful human choices. Moreover, there is no reason, none I can discern, to worry that skepticism about dignity talk diminishes the extent to which one can detest and oppose such suffering, the extent to which, that is, one can take human rights seriously. Nor is there any reason to doubt that one who is skeptical about dignity talk can judge not taking human rights seriously to be a profound failure. The following passage is suggestive of the nature of the failure, a passage from an essay by the late philosopher Richard Rorty, posthumously published in 2021, in which Rorty said of the pragmatist moral philosopher, quote, she sees the ideal of human brotherhood and sisterhood not as the imposition of something non-empirical on the empirical, nor of something non-natural on the natural, but as the culmination of a process of remaking the human species. So in an effort to forestall a possible misunderstanding, I want to conclude my comments by emphasizing that one's aversion to human suffering can and often does exist alongside one's aversion to the suffering of non-human animals. Consider in that regard 3 writings I happened to come across in the course of my studies. 1. Buddhist monk Matthieu Ricard's 2016 book, A Plea for Animals, the moral, philosophical, and evolutionary imperative to treat all beings with compassion. Secondly, University of Toronto moral theologian John Berkman's 2020 article, Must We Love Non-Human Animals? A post-Laudato Si Thomistic Perspective, published in New Blackfriars. And finally, Lutheran religious ethicist Marilyn Matavia's 2020 article, Creature Comfort, Foundations for Christian Hospitality Toward Non-Human Animals, published in the Journal of the Society of Christian Ethics. So there's much more to say about Dignity Talk, some of which I say in my book, but for purposes of my commentary at this launch of David's wonderful new book, I've said enough. Thank you.
So, well, we're invited now to have some conversation among the four of us here who have been part of this panel. And if we have any time left, we'll turn to the audience for this particular challenging approach. I would like to raise a question that really fits in quite well with a number of the comments that were made by various of our three panelists, and that is the question of the practical implication of what we've been talking about. How that you think the church can make a serious contribution to the advancement of human rights in our world today. This is one of the things that the book is about, the divided world in which we live, and one of the sources of that division is religion. We've talked a bit about some of the religious contributions to understanding human rights, but what do any of you have to say about the practical contribution that religious communities can make to human rights and to the protection of rights in the world today? I would open it up to any of you who would like to say anything about that.
Oh, I see I'm being pointed to. Well, as you clearly demonstrate in your book, David, that the church has been a major global leader in this. And I would take that further and say that it's really not contingent on simply being a dominant community in the world. Well, the church is becoming, well, if you look at the question of participation and adherence to religion, is becoming a minority. But when you look at other parts of the world, say in the global south, there is a resurgence, there is a growth in affiliation and in adherence. I think if we are faithful to the traditions of the church over the last several centuries, that can offer us a path to contributing to the fuller implementation, or rather the embrace of human rights. And that would mean that we are paying attention to critical elements, some of which, Michael, you've pointed out, that religion is not simply about personal devotion and being comfortable in one's space of worship, but it's really about that awareness that we have for the rest of creation, all of creation, I would say. And in fact, Michael, when you were talking about the last point you made about consideration and compassion for non-humans. The thing that came through my mind was that, given my own background, I would say we've gone beyond just thinking of non-humans as in animals. In my own upbringing, the entire universe is deserving of compassion. How I treat everything that surrounds me, the trees, the water, the rocks, and the natural elements, is deserving of a certain deep level of reverence and compassion. So I think there is a lot that can still be said about religion's role, David. But it has to be a conscious, intentional, always critical approach to make sure that we are drawing the best of the tradition to respond to unfolding circumstances and situations.
I'm much more focused on the American context. You've got a much broader worldview, but let me just reflect on, what the most important contribution of human rights discourse is in terms of theory and practice in one sense, from my perspective. Up in normal action theory, virtue theory, for example, focuses on how the world looks from the perspective of the agent doing the act. How it's going to affect my character, how it's going to affect myself, what my own objective is in acting. What human rights language did, I think, was switch our focus to the person who is affected by our action. Do unto others. You can see this in Fratelli Tutti and in the tremendous reflection on the Good Samaritan story. This is very easy to do, or not easy, but easier to do in the case of rights to food, shelter, all of those sort of very basic human needs that we all have. It's harder to do, in my view, when it comes to things like religious liberty, because we have our view of what is morally correct, what is religiously correct, what God demands of us, and it's hard to move our worldview into the perspective of the other person who our action is affecting. But I think the most important thing concretely for Catholics in the US to do in our fights about religious liberty is not only to say, I need to protect my right to religious liberty, I need to protect my sphere of operation, but also to say, how is my exercising my right in this context affecting you and your perception of flourishing and your perception of what your obligations are? So it's easy to take that flip in case of hungry people. It's harder to take that flip in the case of people who have very different moral worldviews and religious worldviews than we do.
One other question that came up in all three of your comments was the question of the rights of women. This is an area where I think Michael said this is the most important, or maybe it was the Robotor saying that the rights of women is one of the most important challenges facing the human rights agenda today. We have seen that there's a lot of discussion about the rights of women in the broader human rights discourse, but it becomes very controversial in certain very concrete ways. If you go to the debates about human rights at the United Nations, there's often a dispute about how those rights apply to women, especially when the rights of women are being overlapped with questions about reproductive freedom, various other forms of protection of women's freedom. And this controversy is very live in the world we live in today. I try in my book to address one limited aspect of it, namely in the way in which the rights of women can be seen rather differently from one culture to another. But I think it's also true that the rights of women are being seen very differently from one religion to another. And I'm wondering what the three of you might have to say about that, since all three of you brought up the question of the rights of women as an important topic we're facing today.
I'm not confident I understand the precise question that you're asking.
I'm asking about the role of religion in its relationship to the rights of women, and
Well,
how we can understand adequately or more adequately the ways religious communities could contribute to the advancement of the rights of women.
Any worldview according to which women occupy by nature a secondary or marginal place obviously is going to resist the ideas about women we find in the Human Rights Project. That's obvious. If the question is what one can do about that, it's hard to know what one can do about that.
Or how one would go about doing something about it.
Other than doing, since these cultures are not monolithic, you can find in any of these oppressive, repressive cultures, you can find individuals who are places of resistance. And so to support and cultivate the places of resistance so the critique in the culture can come from the inside rather than from the colonial outside is one way of thinking about this.
Okay.
But the Taliban is a very interesting case. It is hard for me to fathom where you penetrate. Yes, there are Afghan women in exile, and there are women within Afghanistan who oppose, of course, what the Taliban are doing, very quietly, have to, silently, many of them. There is a similar problem, David, with the Catholic Church. So the problem with the Catholic Church is that it is in the grip, it has been, it's hard to say how fast things are changing. It has been the grip of an understandings about sexuality and same-sex relationships, for example. That's the easy case, I think. It's been so confident of those views, thinking those views were views of the way nature is and so forth. You know, how do you break how do you persuade people who are in the grip of those views and so confident in those views? I think it partly is generational, partly it's a question of experience. It's a difficult question. I don't have any quick answer.
Kathy.
I don't have any answers either, but I do have a couple of cautions. One caution is to not assume that all women think monolithically about anything or about, how to go about affecting change in any kind of context. I thought your story in the book of the response of African women to the practice of female genital mutilation, even calling it that, probably would not be a name that they accepted. That was horrifying to me as a Westerner, and horrifying as a woman, but I had to read that and recognize that from their perspective, they did not see it that way. That raises a second point, which is women have many commitments, right? And many women are religious as well as committed to equal dignity of women. I get asked all the time, how can I still be Catholic given what the Catholic Church does on women, on LGBTQ issues, on this, on that, on the sexual abuse crisis? And the reason I stay Catholic is because I believe that the tradition, despite its flaws, has a tremendous amount of wisdom about the nature and purpose of human life to offer, and a process of resources to allow for that kind of critique. And I'm taking the long view. And I assume that Muslim women and Buddhist women and women in Africa have the same kind of connection to their tradition. So I think you need to also recognize women are complicated figures with multiple loyalties.
That's invaluable. Robotor, did you want to say something on
Yes,
that?
I would add to that. First, the caveat that on this question, I believe that the attitude that someone like me should adopt is one of humility and listening, and I'll explain why I think that way. The second thing is that, as Kathleen just said, you know, it's a complex, it's a complicated narrative, and it cannot simply be monolithic. But I would still argue that in those instances where, as a religious community, as a community of faith, we are called to model what inclusion, participation look like, there should be adequate room for the church to be proactive. I, for one, believe that any organization that automatically excludes more than half its population from participating in and taking responsibility for the life of the organization simply has a problem. And that's how I see the church today on this question of women. You know, again, with due respect to, again, I don't want to be the one, you know, claiming to be the outsider who weeps louder than the bereaved, but I do think that there is space for the community called church to model a more inclusive, respectful community for all of its members. And presently, the present arrangement simply doesn't work for me.
Right, and I think that the stress that I place on human rights as guarantees of at least minimum levels of participation in the human community as an approach to human rights applies to the church with regard to the participation of its members in helping to shape the life of the Christian community. And that means women should not be regarded and treated somehow as subordinate to men in the life of the Christian community. So there's a need to bring those two more secular domains and more religious or ecclesial domains together. And I think that the notion of participation is one of the ways in which that would be very strongly stressed. I would raise a question with regard to what Michael has said about disagreeing with Dignity Talk, because I think he may know that we disagree about this issue.
But I don't know why we disagree.
Okay. But I think, for example, your argument that you want to say that we don't want to tolerate the suffering of people as the basis of human rights. I would raise the question about why we want to resist human suffering if we're willing to tolerate certain kinds of suffering among non-humans. I mean,
Okay.
this is so is there a quality possessed by human beings that differentiate them from non-human animals who can be treated in certain ways that we would regard as objectionable if those ways of treating them were applied to humans.
Right.
And I would want to argue that what's involved there is the notion of human dignity. There's a quality of being a human that's different from being a non-human animal.
Right.
And that's what I would call dignity.
That's an excellent question. This is clearly not a venue in which we're going to be able to pursue that issue in a sophisticated way. It's a very complicated discussion. It's a complicated discussion both among people who identify as simply secular, who don't invoke theistic premises. But as my comments try to show you, it's a complicated question even among people who identify as religious, as theistic.
Right.
Because there are going to be some people who identify as theistic and anthropomorphize, as we all know, God, and makes it quite easy for them to be engaging in dignity talk. But there are going to be others who find, as I say, the most intellectually defensible theology on offer to be a radically apophatic, negative theology. And the point I was making is dignity talk, image and likeness of God, God loves us, all of that stuff can't even be accommodated, much less warranted, within the context of a radically apophatic theology. And I think a number of, in many of the Dominican writers I read. Now,
Can I
that
just
raises,
ask you
that raises one question. If you're a priest and this is your view, how does that affect your liturgical duties and your dealing with your parishioners and the like? That's a very interesting question.
I just want to make one small comment on that, and maybe one of the people in our audience, my former colleague and still friend Andrew Prévost, would be able to comment on this. You know, sometimes you got to worry about those Dominicans. One of the things that struck me when you were talking about the theology, and I haven't read this, but I wonder if what they are doing is what's often called natural theology, what you can know simply on the basis of reason. David, and when I work as a theologian, I'm not just a generic theologian thinking about God. I'm thinking about the God who was fully revealed in Jesus Christ, who is the logos, you know, the order or the pattern of the universe, and also is, for Christians, at least Orthodox Christians, the face of God, the original image of God. So one way of answering you, or maybe this is the discussion that needs to take place maybe over drinks later, is whether Christianity, which does make very strong claims about what Jesus tells us about the nature of God and what God says towards us in the context of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament together, if that gives us more of a religious foundation for human rights than the kind of theology which you were talking about, which I didn't quite know how to situate.
So let me say in response to that, that the radically apophatic negative theology that I'm talking about is going to have a revisionist understanding of all of the things that you're now talking about as complementary or supplementary. So they no longer exist for the radical, you might say, but I also work with this. I also believe this. God is revealed, what Jesus said. But the one who finally accepts the radically apophatic theology is going to understand all of that writing in the Bible very differently than you do.
It's also not only just me as Kathy Caveney, but as, you know, the Nicene Creed say.
Well, I'm not, that's interesting to me, but yeah, so what?
Well,
All right.
you might say it's interesting to you, but I wouldn't simply stop at saying it's interesting to me. It's a matter of deep commitment, as Kathleen was saying. Which is a point I was trying to make, that it's not born out of a theory, it's born of a living faith, of encounter, of something that I deeply believe, not because I have understood it, but because it impacted me, and and it shapes how I order my life. You know, can I simply dismiss that as irrelevant?
Dismiss one.
That, I do have faith, and therefore it shapes how I understand.
But we're not talking about faith. We're not talking about dismissing faith. We're talking about God talk of a certain kind. One's faith, the etymology of faith basically involves trust. Faith is not believing that, it's trusting that. Well, and one can trust that. It all makes sense. It's ultimately not crazy and so forth. One can be a person of deep faith and still profoundly skeptical of the prevailing forms of God talk.
That is true.
So in fact, you are the dean of the School of Theology at Santa Clara University. Some years ago, I was invited there to give a lecture. And after the lecture, I was having dinner with a couple of Jesuits, theologians, I imagine. They weren't law professors. And I raised this question of how problematic God talk is. And it was very interesting, their reply. Their reply to me was, oh, we understand all that. All of that makes perfect sense to us. But God Talk permits us to talk to other people in other faiths, Muslims and others, who don't find God Talk so problematic. And we really value the opportunity to do that. So it's not just the New Blackfriar Dominicans. It's, I think, many people who spend a lot of time thinking about theology, theologos, talk about God, may arrive at a point where they see a lot of stuff, including the Nicene Creed, as very, very old, very revered.
yeah.
But nonetheless, that's not the conversation stopper.
Okay, well, I think we're coming
he
to
is
the
the
end of our time here, and I would like to just suggest that one of the things that's being raised here is when we talk about human rights from a Christian point of view, we're getting into some areas that are really deeply theological. And there's a lot of room for theological debate about some of the issues that we're raising. For example, about how the human person relates to the community. This is a very serious and long-standing debate, and it's very present in the current debate about the meaning of human rights. And so there are various other theological issues that are at stake. There are also secular issues that are at stake, and I think they're very important ones. But it's time for us to stop. We have a reception in the adjoining room. We can go out and have a glass of wine together, continue the conversation. I invite everyone who's here to join us for the reception and to join in the conversation with our panelists, and I'm happy to talk to you about the book as well. So thanks to everybody for being here. It's been a pleasure to be with you. It's been a pleasure to hear the reactions of 3 of my distinguished colleagues to my book, and I look forward to conversation with you in the conversation in the time that we have during the reception. So thank you very much.